There is a creature in Tolkien's world that Morgoth himself feared. Not feared the way a general fears a rival army, calculating odds and adjusting tactics. Feared the way something ancient and powerful recognizes, in a single moment of pressure against its will, that the thing in front of it is beyond its understanding and beyond its control. Feared the way you fear a dark that does not simply surround you but begins to eat you. This creature is not one the movies ever showed you. It is not part of the hierarchy of darkness that descends from Morgoth through his servants and his monsters. It exists outside that hierarchy. It predates it. And what is most unsettling, what separates this from every other dark thing in the legendarium, is that Tolkien himself, when pressed to explain what it was and where it came from, admitted he could not say. His exact words, preserved in the notes collected in Morgoth's Ring, the 10th volume of the history of Middle-earth, he did not know whether this creature was of Arda's own being, or came from outside creation entirely, from the void that existed before the music began. So here is the question this video orbits. Was this creature part of the world Morgoth sought to ruin? Or was it the thing that was there before the world began, waiting in a darkness the music of creation never reached? There is no clean answer, but the attempt to find one will take us deeper into the legendarium than most people ever go, and what we find down there is going to change how you see everything else. The creature is Ungoliant. You know the name, even if you only know it faintly. You have seen her descendants. Shelob, in the pass of Cirith Ungol, is Ungoliant's last great child. The monstrous spiders of Mirkwood that Bilbo and the dwarves fought in The Hobbit are her distant offspring. And what the movies never told you is that Shelob is not a monster Sauron made. She predates Sauron's occupation of Mordor by centuries. The chapter, The Choices of Master Samwise in The Return of the King, states explicitly that Shelob was the last child of Ungoliant to trouble the unhappy world, and that Sauron neither made her nor fully controlled her. He merely fed her, and she served her own darkness, not his. Think about what that means. Sauron, the Dark Lord, the maker of the One Ring, the being whose eye swept across all of Middle-earth searching for what he had lost, did not control the creature living in his own mountain pass. He fed her like a man who puts out food for a wolf he cannot tame, hoping it stays close enough to be useful. That is not control. That is the management of something too dangerous to remove. But Shelob is only the echo. To understand what Ungoliant actually was, you have to go back to the Silmarillion, to the chapter of the Darkening of Valinor, where she appears not as background scenery, but as the architect of the most catastrophic single act of destruction in the entire history of Middle-earth. Here is what the text says. Ungoliant dwelt in a cleft of the mountains, at the edge of Aman, in a region called Avathar, below the sheer walls of the Pelori. In a darkness she had made herself. Not darkness that was already there. Darkness she spun from herself, and wove around herself. An active darkness that devoured light, rather than simply being absent of it. Tolkien calls it the unlight of Ungoliant. A specific thing, a specific force, a hunger made into substance. Unlight, not shadow, not night, but unlight. The negation of light itself, generated by a being whose nature was to consume. Now here is where it gets strange. The Valar, the great divine powers of Tolkien's world, the beings who shaped Middle-earth and governed its fate, could not see into Avathar. Manwë, the king of the Valar, the most powerful of the Ainur who entered the world, whose sight could penetrate mountains and reach across vast distances, could not see through the darkness Ungoliant made around herself. She was hidden from divine sight. In a world where the Valar are beings of immense perception, the existence of a creature who simply cannot be seen by them is remarkable. It means she existed outside the categories they use to understand the world. It means her darkness was not just deep, it was categorically different, and Tolkien cannot tell us why, because he did not know. That is not a rhetorical device. That is Tolkien, in his own notes, acknowledging that he had created something whose origin was genuinely outside the framework he had built. The Ainulindalë, the great music of creation in the Silmarillion, accounts for everything that came into being in Arda. Every Vala, every Maya, every creature, every spirit, every element of the physical world, all of it emerged from, or was shaped by that music. Morgoth's discord is part of the music. Evil in Tolkien's world is parasitic, always building on or corrupting something good. There is no creation in evil, only distortion. Ungoliant does not fit that framework. She does not serve Morgoth. She does not serve any power. She serves her own hunger, which is infinite and can never be satisfied. And the manner in which she consumes is not corruption, it is obliteration. She does not twist light into shadow. She devours it completely, converts it into more of herself, more of the unlight she spins from her own body. That is not what evil does in Tolkien's world. That is something else entirely. Picture this: a vast web spun not of silk, but of woven darkness, hanging in a cleft of ancient mountains at the very edge of the sacred land where the Valar dwell. The web does not catch insects or birds. It catches light. It drinks it. The mountains around this cleft are illuminated by the great two trees of Valinor, the source of all light in the world, before the sun and moon were made, their radiance spreading across the land in long waves of gold and silver. And in that cleft, the web drinks what it can reach, small sips of stolen glory, just enough to sustain a hunger that can never be filled. Something waits there, in its self-made darkness, that is not part of the order of the world. And it is patient. It has been patient for a very long time. It was there long before Morgoth found it. Here is the thing nobody asks about the darkening of Valinor. Everyone knows the story in broad outline. Morgoth destroyed the two trees. The light of the world was extinguished. The Silmarils were stolen. The long tragedy begins. But nobody stops to ask who approached whom. The Silmarillion answers this directly. Morgoth came to Ungoliant. He descended from his secret position on the heights of Taniquetil, moved south along the outer walls of the Pelori, and sought out this creature in her cleft at the edge of the world. He needed her specifically, needed her darkness, needed her ability to blind the sight of the Valar and drink the light of the two trees simultaneously, needed her to do something he could not do alone. The most powerful Dark Lord in the history of the world went to find a creature that terrified him and asked for its help. Pay attention to what that reveals about Ungoliant. Morgoth, who overthrew the great lamps of the world in the earliest age of its existence, who corrupted many of the Ainur before the world was even made, who had spent his entire existence demonstrating that no power in creation was beyond his reach or his ruin, goes to this thing in the dark and proposes a partnership, not because he cannot destroy the two trees himself, though there is an argument to be made there, but because he cannot do what she can do. Devour the light so completely that not even the Valar can see what is happening until it is too late. He needed her darkness. She was better at darkness than he was. That is the betrayal frame the movies will never show you. The entire mythology of Middle-earth assumes a hierarchy. Morgoth at the top of evil, his servants below him, all darkness flowing from him as from a source. What the lore reveals is that this hierarchy breaks down immediately when you reach Ungoliant. She is not below Morgoth. She is not above him. She is simply not in it. She is something else, something that predates the categories, and Morgoth needed her in a way he could never acknowledge without undermining everything his identity was built on. So he made a promise. In the Silmarillion, Morgoth promises Ungoliant that she can have whatsoever she desired from the fruits of their plan, if she will help him darken Valinor and escape with him to the north. The greed of the promise is almost comic in retrospect, because Ungoliant's desire is simply everything. There is no limit to it, but Morgoth makes the promise anyway, which means he is already planning to break it, or he believes the promise is so vast in its scope that it cannot be called, or, most chillingly, he simply does not fully understand that she means it literally. From Tolkien's broader cosmological writings, and from the principles articulated in Letter 144 of the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, the foundational rule of evil in Arda is this: evil cannot create. It can only corrupt, diminish, and devour. Morgoth cannot make new light. He can only extinguish existing light. His entire career has been one long act of destruction, dressed as ambition. He ruins what others have made. Ungoliant devours. But there is a difference between Morgoth's destruction and Ungoliant's consumption, and it matters enormously. When Morgoth ruins something, the ruin is still there. The corruption remains. The wound persists in the world. Even his greatest acts of destruction, the overthrow of the lamps, the poisoning of the two trees, the burning of the forests of the north, leave wreckage. The world is changed. The evidence is visible and specific. The grief is located. When Ungoliant devours something, it is simply gone. Here is what actually happened at the mound of Izelohar, where the two trees grew. Morgoth stabbed the trees with his black spear, and their sap poured forth. But before anyone could respond, before anyone could attempt to save them or draw on the last of their light, Ungoliant was already drinking. Not taking, not stealing. Drinking. The text says she sucked up the dripping light, and then put her lips to the wounds, and drank until the trees were dry. She then drank the dew from the hollows of the ground, where light had fallen. And then she swelled to a shape so vast and hideous that Ungoliant horrified even herself. That last detail, she grew so large from what she had consumed that she horrified herself. She was drinking from what felt like an infinite well, and her capacity was expanding to meet it. And even she, in that moment of total consumption, felt something that might have been fear at what she was becoming. That is the kind of creature we are talking about. The unlight she released after drinking the two trees is what Tolkien calls the darkness of Ungoliant, and it is described as something qualitatively different from ordinary darkness. In Of the Darkening of Valinor, Tolkien writes that it was an impenetrable darkness that she drew about herself and Morgoth as they fled, through which she passed like a cloak of shadow. The Valar could not see through it. Light could not penetrate it. It was not merely the absence of light. It was the active presence of something that light could not exist alongside, because Ungoliant would immediately consume it. This is not metaphor. In Tolkien's world, the lights of Valinor were real, physical, cosmic things. The Silmarils themselves captured and preserved the light of the two trees after the trees died. The light of the Silmarils is described in the Silmarillion as a holy light, sacred, the most perfect physical manifestation of the divine in all of Arda. Ungoliant's darkness is the one thing in the world that stands against that light, not as shadow stands against illumination, but as consumption stands against existence. And now think about what happened next. When Morgoth and Ungoliant fled north, over the grinding ice, across the sea, and down into the ruins of Angband, they carried with them the Silmarils and the lesser jewels of the Noldor. Morgoth had promised Ungoliant her fill. She demanded payment. The Silmarillion states that Morgoth was loth to give what she asked, that he grudged the Silmarils to her. He tried to cheat her, the most powerful Dark Lord in the history of the world, who had spent an eternity accumulating power and treasure, who valued the Silmarils above all other things, precisely because Feanor had encoded the last sacred light of the trees into them, tried to break his promise to the creature that had just helped him commit the greatest act of destruction in the history of creation. She seized him. Ungoliant had grown great from what she had drunk, the text says, and she enveloped him in a cloud of her black webs, and then set upon him. She had him pinned. In the ruins of Angband, in the dark of his own ancient stronghold, the first Dark Lord was being overpowered by something he had summoned and could not control. Morgoth screamed. He cried out in anguish, and that cry rolled through the earth and echoed in the mountains. The Balrogs, his most powerful remaining servants, the spirits of fire that had followed him since before the world was made, heard that cry and came to him. Think about what it took to make Morgoth scream. This is a being who has faced the wrath of the Valar, who has fought in the wars of the world's earliest ages, who was bound in chains and imprisoned for ages, and came back from it without breaking. He is not built for fear. He is not built for weakness, and in the ruins of Angband, wrapped in the webs of a creature he had tried to cheat, he screamed for help. The Balrogs drove Ungoliant off with whips of flame. She fled. The Silmarillion says she went into Nan Dung-Gortheb, the valley of dreadful death in the mountains of shadow on the north marches of Beleriand, and there she bred and multiplied, and her offspring spread across the mountains and the dark valleys between the hills, filling them with what the text calls unreasoning fear. She was not defeated. She was chased away. There is a difference. And that difference matters enormously for what came after. Here is what nobody talks about when they discuss the spiders of Middle-earth. Tolkien did not create giant spiders as a generic fantasy monster. He gave them a specific lineage, a specific cosmological origin, a specific reason for existing in the places they exist. And that reason is Ungoliant. Every spider in Middle-earth with any narrative significance, from the creatures of Nan Dung-Gortheb to the spiders of Mirkwood to Shelob in her pass, is a piece of Ungoliant still alive in the world. But let me be precise, because the lore is specific, and the distinction matters. From Of Beren and Luthien, in the Silmarillion, the forest of Nan Dung-Gortheb is described as a place of multiple horrors. It sits between the peaks of the arid Gorgoroth, the mountains of Terra, and the borders of Doriath, Thingol's protected kingdom. It is a place that the elves of Doriath will not enter. It is described as a place of shadows and dread, so thick that even the greatest elven warriors choose paths around it rather than through it. The spiders that live there are Ungoliant's children, and they have inherited her hunger and something of her unlight, enough to make the place radiantly terrifying in a way that cannot be explained by mere physical danger. Tolkien describes the effect of Nandungortheb in terms that are psychologically rather than physically menacing. It is not that the creatures there will necessarily kill you, although they will. It is that something in the place itself attacks reason and will and the ability to resist, in a way that suggests the darkness there is not just ecological, but metaphysical. Ungoliant's unlight, that active consuming darkness, has soaked into the landscape. Picture this: a mountain pass where the peaks are so high they block the sun for most of the day, leaving the valley in permanent shadow. In that shadow, webs hang not between trees but between the faces of cliffs, hundreds of feet across, older than any structure any elf or man has built. The spiders that made those webs are not hunting prey in any ordinary sense. They are waiting, with a patience that is almost geological in its timescale, because their hunger is Ungoliant's hunger, and Ungoliant's hunger was never urgent. It was eternal. A figure who enters this valley begins to feel, gradually, a thinning of thought, a dissolution of purpose, as though the darkness itself is consuming something from inside the mind. The figure does not know why they feel afraid. They only know that the fear is becoming everything, and that the rational part of them that should be solving problems and planning escape is simply not answering anymore. That is what Ungoliant built in Nandungortheb. Not a nest, a dominion. Now hold that alongside what Tolkien writes about Shelob in The Choices of Master Samwise in The Return of the King. Tolkien describes her as existing outside Sauron's control, feeding on elvish folk, or dwarves, or men who wandered into her pass, living in darkness and filth of her own devising. And then the crucial passage: she served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men, bloated and grown fat with endless feasting. Endless feasting. Then Tolkien adds, she was there before Sauron, and before the first stone of Barad-dûr, and she served none but herself. She was there before Sauron, before Barad-dûr. She predates the entire Third Age construction of Mordor as a dark domain. She is older than the mythology that surrounds her, and she serves none but herself. That phrase is the most important in the passage. Not that she is dangerous, not that she is ancient, but that she serves none but herself. Because in Middle-earth, that is the most radical possible statement about a creature's nature. Everything in that world, ultimately, serves something or someone. The Valar serve Ilúvatar. Even Morgoth, in his rebellion, serves the chaos that is the shadow of his own frustrated creativity. Sauron serves his desire for order and domination. Orcs serve their masters through corruption and fear. Even Tom Bombadil, the most sovereign figure in the books, exists within the created world and takes his nature from it. Shelob, and through Shelob, Ungoliant, serves nothing. That places Ungoliant outside every category Tolkien built his world around. Which brings us to the deepest question in all of this. If Ungoliant had gotten the Silmarils, what would have happened to them? This is where canon ends, and structured speculation begins. But it follows with genuine urgency from what we know. The Silmarils are described in the Silmarillion as containing the light of the two trees blended and cooled within the hallowed substance that Feanor created. They are the only physical objects in the history of Middle-earth that contain and perpetuate the original light of creation. The trees are dead. The light of the trees, in physical form, exists only in the Silmarils. Tolkien also writes, in Of the Silmarils and the Unrest of the Noldor, that the Silmarils were hallowed by Varda, the Queen of Stars, so that no mortal flesh, nor hands unclean, nor anything of evil will, could touch them without suffering pain and wasting. Morgoth bore them in his iron crown, and they seared his hands and caused him perpetual pain. Ungoliant could not have held them. She has no hands. But she drank, she consumed. She drank the light of the two trees directly, without the intervention of hallowed substance or divine protection. She converted the most sacred light in Arda into unlight, into more of herself. Now here is where it gets strange. If Ungoliant had been given the Silmarils, if she had somehow been able to consume them, rather than merely clutch them? What happens to the light inside them? The Silmarils are physical objects containing divine, hallowed light. Ungoliant's consumption is total. She does not corrupt. She obliterates. If she had consumed the Silmarils, she would have consumed the last remaining physical light of the two trees. Not dimmed it, not stolen it, ended it, permanently. After the War of Wrath, at the end of the First Age, one Silmaril is carried into the sky by Eärendil and becomes a star, the star of high hope that burns in the west as a sign to all peoples of Middle-earth. Another is cast into the deep sea. Another falls into a pit of fire. But all three still exist. The light of the trees, however divided and separated from its origin, persists. If Ungoliant had consumed the Silmarils, that light would simply not be there anymore. There would be no star of hope. There would be no light of Eärendil that Galadriel, the immortal elven queen, gave to Frodo in the File, that saves his life in the very pass where Shelob, Ungoliant's last daughter, dwells. The chain of preservation, from the two trees to the Silmarils, to the star, to the File, would be broken at its second link. What Morgoth was defending when he refused her the Silmarils was not just his treasure. He was, accidentally, preserving the only surviving light of the world. Think about that. The villain who destroyed the light was the one who prevented the even greater darkness from consuming the last of what he destroyed. There is no clean reading of that. It is one of Tolkien's most extraordinary cosmological ironies, buried deep in the lore, never discussed, never filmed, almost never noticed. The Arch-Destroyer as the unwitting preserver, the Dark Lord as the last line between the world's remaining light and an oblivion he could not himself have caused. And now we have to confront the question of Ungoliant's fate, because it is one of the strangest passages in all of the Legendarium. The Silmarillion says, after describing her retreat to Nandungortheb, that in that time her webs of darkness were spread far and wide, and her offspring multiplied, and that her descendants filled the mountain passes and the dark places of the world. And then, shortly after, of the fate of Ungoliant after these things, no sure tidings are to be had. Some have said that she went into the south of the world, and hungered in the darkness, and grew great still, and she consumed herself at last. Read that sentence carefully. She consumed herself at last. If that is what happened, then Ungoliant's fate is the most perfect possible expression of her nature. A hunger that can never be satisfied, that grows as it feeds, that eventually has nothing left to consume but itself. She became her own prey. The darkness ate the darkness. But Tolkien is careful with his language here. Some have said, no sure tidings are to be had. This is not the narrative telling you what happened. This is the narrative admitting it does not know. The sources disagree. Ungoliant's fate is genuinely uncertain. In the drafts collected in the History of Middle-earth, Tolkien wrote alternatives in which Ungoliant simply went into the south and was seen no more, an ending even more deliberately vague than the self-consumption version. In some drafts, her fate is left entirely open, with no explanation given, as though she might still be out there, in some darkness at the edge of the world, in some place the music of creation never reached, waiting. Here is why that ambiguity is not a failure of Tolkien's plotting, but a feature of his cosmology. Ungoliant is the only major being in the Legendarium whose existence cannot be accounted for by the Ainul Indal. Everything else in the world was made through or from the music of creation. Even evil, even Morgoth's corruption, is part of that music, the dark thread that gives the whole pattern its depth and its meaning. Tolkien writes in the Ainul Indal itself that Ilúvatar allowed Morgoth's discord to exist because it would be to the greater glory of his work, as the darkness of the evil one brings forth the light. Even the deepest evil serves a purpose in the music. Ungoliant does not serve the music. She predates it, or exists alongside it, or fell into the world from outside it. And a being whose existence cannot be accounted for by the world's creation cannot be easily destroyed by the world's mechanisms. That is why she consumed herself at last, feels like the version that honors her nature without claiming to fully understand it. She did not die. She did not lose. She was not defeated. She simply became entirely herself, consumed her own consumption, and disappeared from the narrative the same way she had appeared, without explanation, without domestication, without anyone truly understanding what she was. Picture this: the south of the world, past the known lands, past the great sea, into distances that no map covers, and no elf or man has ever reached. A darkness moving across that unmapped territory, growing as it passes, eating the dimmer lights of stars reflected in still water, consuming shadows for their residual substance, and still hungry. Always still hungry. And then, slowly, over centuries, turning inward, not a defeat, a conclusion. The thing she was finally consuming was herself, and she was vast enough by then to take a very long time to finish. That is one version of what happened. Maybe the only honest version. Or maybe she is still out there. But there is a passage in the Two Towers that most people read past without stopping. And it connects to all of this in a way that should give you pause. When the aged wizard who becomes Gandalf the White describes his battle with the Balrog, the long fall, the deep places beneath Moria, he says something that should arrest every reader, and almost never does. He says, "Far, far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. They are older than he. Older than Sauron. Sauron is a Maya, one of the lesser divine powers who entered the world at its creation. He has been present in Arda since before the music was complete. To be older than Sauron means to predate the world's ordering. It means to be of the category that exists before or outside the Ainulindal, Ungoliant's category. Tolkien never draws this connection explicitly. The nameless things have no names, no described forms, no lore attached to them beyond that single devastating passage. We do not know if they are related to Ungoliant. We do not know if they predate her or exist alongside her in some dark taxonomy that the world's ordering never reached. But here is the logical chain, following Tolkien's own cosmological rules. If there are beings beneath the world that are older than Sauron and that Sauron does not know, then Tolkien is telling us that the ordering of creation was not complete, that the music accounted for most things but not all things, that there are presences in Arda that the Valar have not catalogued, and that the Dark Lords have not mastered. Ungoliant is the most prominent member of that uncatalogued presence. The nameless things suggest she is not alone. Here is the thing nobody talks about when they discuss Tolkien's moral architecture. Tolkien is explicitly a Christian mythologist. His legendarium is built on a cosmology where evil is always secondary to good, always parasitic, always ultimately self-defeating. Good has a ground, a source, a creator, whose plan encompasses even the worst discord. That is the bedrock of his world. Ungoliant cracks that bedrock. She is the one element in Tolkien's work that does not fit the clean moral architecture he spent decades building. She is not a fallen good being. She is not corruption in the service of greater ruin. She is not, as far as Tolkien can determine, of divine origin at all. She simply exists, and her existence is hunger, and that hunger has no moral valence and no ultimate purpose. And maybe that is the most frightening thing about her, not that she is evil, but that she is nothing the word evil is designed to describe. There is one more thread to pull before we reach the end of this. Feanor created the Silmarils over a great span of years, and their creation is described in Of Feanor and the Unchaining of Melkor, in the Silmarillion, as the greatest work ever accomplished by the children of Ilúvatar. He captured the light of Telperion and Laurelin within a hallowed crystal he developed himself, and then Varda blessed the Silmarils so that nothing unclean could hold them without pain. He created them in part because of a premonition, not a prophecy, not a direct warning from the Valar. A feeling, described by Tolkien, that the light of the trees was precious in a way that required preservation, that something in the world was seeking to diminish it. Tolkien writes that Feanor was already come under the shadow of the doom before Morgoth's poisoning of the trees, that his work was animated by a grief not yet felt. Whether he foresaw Ungoliant specifically, we cannot say. Tolkien does not say. But the work of preservation came before the destruction, as though something in Valinor understood, however dimly, that there was a hunger out there that could devour the light entirely and leave nothing. Picture this. Feanor in his forge, the light of Laurelin flooding through high windows, catching the substance he is shaping, and that substance drinking the light and holding it, concentrating it, each gem becoming a miniature of the trees themselves. He does not know that in a cleft of the mountains at the edge of the world, something dwells that weaves darkness from its own body, and waits. He does not know about Ungoliant, but his hands move with an urgency he cannot explain, and the Silmarils take shape faster than he intended, as though they know they are needed, and the window for their creation is narrower than it appears. The hallowing protects against anything of evil will, but Ungoliant's will is not evil in a legible sense. Her will is hunger. Whether the protection would have held against pure, purposeless consumption is a question Tolkien never answered. It almost had to answer itself at Angband. Morgoth refused. The Balrogs came. Ungoliant fled. The Silmarils were preserved. And maybe that is the answer to the central question, arrived at from a direction nobody expected. Maybe the world's ordering is not complete. Maybe there are things in the dark that the music of creation never reached. But maybe the light that was preserved in that music is strong enough, barely, by the narrowest of margins, to survive even the things outside it, as long as one sufficiently greedy Dark Lord is standing between those things and the last light, holding it close because he cannot bear to share it. Maybe, or maybe Morgoth's greed, one of the most comprehensively destructive forces in the history of his world, accidentally saved the last surviving light purely because he did not want to give it away. That is the kind of story Tolkien told. A story where the salvation of the world depends not on heroism or divine intervention, but on a villain's selfishness. Where the darkness is contained not by the light overpowering it, but by a slightly larger darkness, refusing to yield to a darker darkness still. Where the chain of preservation from the trees to the Silmarils to the star to the file in Frodo's pocket holds together because of an act of betrayal in the ruins of Angband, in the first age of the world. Now let's talk about what this actually means. Tolkien spent most of his life building a world where good has a source, and evil is a distortion of that source. In the Ainulindale, Iluvatar looks at Morgoth's discord and says, "No theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall be but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Even the worst evil in Tolkien's world is ultimately incorporated into a larger good. Ungoliant is the exception he could not incorporate. He tried. The story of self-consumption is an attempt to give her a Tolkienian resolution, a fate where her nature turns against itself and destroys her, a fate that is internally consistent with who she is. But even that ending is held at arm's length, presented as a rumor, some have said, not as confirmed fact. Because the alternative, the version where she simply goes south and is seen no more, where she persists somewhere in the unmapped world, where her hunger continues in some darkness beyond the reach of any narrative, is also present, also possible, also perhaps more honest. Here is what I think Tolkien understood, even if he could not fully articulate it, about Ungoliant. She represents the possibility that creation is not entirely ordered, that the music, for all its glory and scope, left some spaces it did not fill. Not gaps in the good, but absences in the complete account. Places where something exists that does not derive from the music, does not serve its purposes, does not fit within its categories, and therefore cannot be fully resolved by its logic. That is a genuinely unsettling cosmological admission for a writer whose mythology is built on the completeness of divine creation. And I think Tolkien kept her fate uncertain precisely because he could not find a resolution that did not betray either the integrity of his world or the integrity of what she actually was. She is the place where his faith in ordered creation met something it could not account for. She terrified him, in the same way she terrified Morgoth. Not because she was powerful, because she was beyond the category, because she was the one thing in his world that the music could not encompass, that even his deepest creative effort could not fully explain. The viewer who has followed this all the way down ends here understanding Middle-earth not as a world of ordered good versus ordered evil, but as something more complicated, more honest, more like the world we actually live in. A world mostly organized around purposes and meanings and sources, but with something at the edges, something older, something that the organizing principles do not quite reach, something that simply hungers in the dark and waits, and has always been waiting, and may be waiting still. There is a reason Tolkien could not say where Ungoliant came from. Not carelessness, not a gap he meant to fill and never got to. He could not say because the question has no answer inside the world he built. The music of creation is the origin of everything in Arda. Tolkien built that origin with extraordinary care over decades of revision, and he built it so that even the worst evil is part of it. Even Morgoth's fall is part of it. The tragedy of the Silmarils, the breaking of the world, the loss of the trees, the long defeat that is the entire First Age. All of it flows from the music and serves the music's deeper purposes, even when those purposes are invisible to the people living through them. Ungoliant does not flow from the music. She is not part of the tragedy. She is not even part of the evil. She is the place where the music ended, and something else was already there. Something that preceded the question of good and evil entirely. Something that would have been there whether the music played or not. Morgoth feared that. Sauron, who lived for millennia in the Third Age without ever mastering what dwelt in his own mountain pass, was wise enough to leave it alone and feed it rather than confront it. The Valar, whose sight penetrated mountains and oceans, could not see into the darkness she wove around herself. In the end, what terrorized Middle-earth was not a creation of any dark lord. It was not a weapon, not a servant, not a strategy. It was a hunger without a source and without a purpose, older than the oldest Dark Lord, outside the categories that made sense of everything else, and the world survived it. Barely, by the margin of one Dark Lord's greed refusing to share a set of jewels, but survived. Which brings us back to the question that has been at the center of this whole conversation. The question that is heavier now than it was at the beginning, now that you know what we have walked through to get here. Was Ungoliant a creature of Morgoth's world? Was she something he could have claimed as part of his domain, a deeper expression of the discord he introduced into the music, something that, with different choices, he might have mastered? Or was she the thing that was there before the world began, waiting in a darkness the music never reached, patient with the patience of something that does not age or tire or despair, watching from a cleft at the edge of creation, while light moved across the world below, and deciding, finally, that it might be time to drink? The text does not know. Tolkien did not know. And I think that is exactly right, because some questions are not meant to be answered. Some questions are meant to be felt in the dark, in the moment between sleeping and waking, when the light goes out, and something in the back of your mind remembers that not everything in the world was made by the same hand that made the rest of it. If this is the kind of question that keeps you up at night, that sends you back into the books looking for the passage you might have missed, the one that finally explains what she was and where she went, and whether she is truly gone, you are exactly who this channel is for. Drop your reading in the comments. Tell me which version of her fate you believe. The self-consumption, the silent south, or the one where she is still out there in some unmapped dark, still hungry, still patient, still waiting for someone to open the door again. Tell me what you think she was, because I have been sitting with this question for a long time, and I still do not have an answer, and I think the conversation that starts in the comments might be the only place where one could possibly begin to form. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the parts of this world that were never meant to be simple.